N-I. N-I.
Oh,
N-I. Is it spelled
oh, Todd, just a quick confirmation. Is it all right if we record this meeting?
Yeah. Oh, Nate. Okay.
Or would you prefer it?
It is totally okay. I'm also requesting to record. Haha.
Oh, perfect. Um, well, in that case, we can record it, and I think Zoom lets you record it simultaneously, but if it does
Yep.
not, we'll make sure to send that over to you as well.
Yep. It's probably just easiest to record twice.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So, for anyone who has joined us most recently, please take a moment to sign in either by scanning the QR code or clicking the link in the chat. We have a very exciting speaker today. Todd Beardsley has volunteered to share with us his Black Hat talk about interpreting different vulnerability scoring systems and being able to use that insight to communicate risk effectively to the business, which is really what cybersecurity is at its core. So we'll go through a couple quick announcements first before we get into it. First off, anybody who is new here, please take a moment to scan our Discord and our Linktree codes. Stephen has also put that into the chat as well. This will be how you keep in contact with us as a club and how we can get information to you about exciting events such as this going forward. So I'm going to let that sit a moment. Once, twice, 3 times sold. All right, sure. And moving on to some general announcements. We have the Cybersecurity Awareness Fair annually occurring at Cal Poly coming up on October 7th. That'll be a really good opportunity for all of us to get involved and meet some of the other clubs on campus, as well as industry professionals who are visiting the campus to talk about cyber initiatives in the community, as well as maybe even present your own research and work. There is a poster competition available, and there is a cash prize for those who participate and do well. So I do highly encourage you to check that out. Alex would be happy to provide more information on that if you have any questions on how to get involved. And then additionally, we have a team that we're putting together led by Michael, who is currently held up at work, but we will be sure to send out that information if you would like to get involved. And we're going to be doing a IP camera penetration testing demonstration. And it'll be kind of like a Spy Kids kind of workshop where attendees to our booth will have the opportunity to break into a camera, control it, tilt it around, look at things, and then exfiltrate. And then additionally, 2 nights, ISACA LA is hosting their career nights at Kellogg West. It is a business casual and up event, and students pay the price of only $20, and you get opportunities to meet industry professionals, network with them, get career and resume workshop advice, as well as sit into a panel of speakers. I think they have 4 or 5 speakers tonight. And did I mention buffet? So do consider scanning that QR code and going to ISACA LA's website and looking up their career night event. I'll leave that up for a couple moments more. Once, twice, 3 times sold. Okay. I don't recommend going in an evening gown, but please, if you've done that in the course of your career and it's worked, we would love to hear that story. All right, and with that, I would like to pass it over to Todd to take it away with deciphering signals from vulnerability scores.
Thank you. I am screen sharing. I don't see this reflected on your screen because you're also screen sharing. I assume my slides will show up on the screen behind you. There we are. Getting there. Perfect. Dope. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation. I lived in Southern California very briefly, and so it's nice to be back. I used to go to the University of Redlands, which is probably 3 or 4 tiers under Cal Poly. But I went there very briefly in the 90s. Um, School's important, I guess. All right. Uh, let's move on to what we're all here to talk about. So this is, as you might be able to tell from the styling, a talk I gave at Black Hat. This is a subject near and dear to my heart, and it's all about vulnerability harospasy, which is an extremely fun word that I learned for this presentation. Um, so let's get into it. We'll get into what harospasy is too. No spoilers. So basically, that's going to be the intro. What is harospasy? And we'll go into that just a little bit. And then we're going to talk about the 3 scoring systems anyone really cares about. Um, I would argue maybe only 2 that anyone cares about, and 1 that I care about. So CVSS is the one that is the oldest and it's the most established. It's written into regulations and laws and stuff now. So that is the one with some sticking power. A new relative newcomer, EPSS, which is a machine learning based way to score systems. Don't worry, I'll expand all these acronyms in a minute. If you haven't heard of them before, that's fine. And then SSVC, which is very feelings based, I would say. A little less rigorous than the other 2, but also useful, which is kind of magical, actually. So let's get into it. So harospasy is the art of divining the will of the gods through sacrificial animal entrails, usually livers. Livers are weird and amazing organs that are in all mammals have them. And typically, what would happen in these cultures that would practice harospasy is you'd go to the harospeks and you'd say, "Hey, we have an upcoming military campaign. Is it going to go good or bad for us?" Or you might ask, like, "What are the crops going to be doing this season?" You generally have to form your question in a yes or no. And then the harospeks will sacrifice your animal, take out the liver, and get to work. They will look at potentially thousands. It's a lot. It's a lot of book learning to be a Haraspex. They will look at tons of signals that are in the liver. And it's things like, it's very kind of similar to palmistry, except more gory. So like they'll look at things like the like little fat lines that bisect the liver. You have like basically a lobe up on one side. Don't worry, this has something to do with vulnerability scoring systems. Um, but basically, you take all of the favorable omens and all the unfavorable omens, you add them together, and then you get a positive or negative result, right? And so that gets you the answer to the question you're asking, right? So if any of you have taken a stats class yet, you probably know about p hacking. So basically, what harospexes are doing here is they take random signals. They assert they're not actually random, they are meaningful, and also I can use these to tell the future. Um, in that sense, it is extremely similar to vulnerability scoring systems in that we take a bunch of signals of some of them are of dubious quality, and we try to add them together and we try to figure out like, is this vulnerability bad? Or can I kind of sit on this for a minute? Like, do I have to patch all the things all the time? And so that's what vulnerability scoring systems get you. So, with that said, I've lost my mouse focus. There we go. And so let's get into CVSS. CVSS is the common vulnerability scoring system. It is quite common. Um, Most of the time, when you're reading about vulnerabilities and you're starting to do some sorting based on severity, invariably you're probably looking at CVSS scores. There's 8 vectors in there. And they describe things like, is it available over the network, or do I already need to have a user account to exploit this vulnerability? Something like that, right? Um, it is not specifically tied to CVE, which is the Common Vulnerability Exposure List, which is a dictionary of vulnerabilities that lives out there on the internet. Um, it is often applied to CVEs, but not always, and you can apply CVSS to vulnerabilities that don't yet have a CVE score. So that sometimes gets to be important, depending on what tooling you're using, right? There is the most common version used today is version 3.1. There is a version 4. It's about 2 years old now. Version 4 talks a little more about like the scope of effect of the vulnerability, which we'll get into in here in a second. But it does this by asking like 3 more questions, and that's irritating for people doing the scoring. So this is why most people have stuck with 3.1. 3.1 is like the winner of all the versions. CVSS, the biggest thing it's great at is giving you a yes or no answer, much like our haruspixes of times past, right? It is great for checkbox security. You can have a rule that says, I must patch things that are CVSS 7.0 or higher and ignore everything that falls under that. Like, that is a rule, and that is a rule that some people actually use out in the world. I think it's crazy, but that is the way to do it, right? Like that is how you start cutting off vulnerabilities from things I don't care about to things I care about, right? CVSS is also super great for writing tech headlines, especially when they're CVSS 10.0, which is the highest, worst score you can get in CVSS. It's a range from 0.0 to 10.0. The decimals make it sound more sciencey, and I think that's the only reason why there are decimals there. These are not real numbers, by the way. You can't do things like add one CVSS score to another and get a sensible result. They're much more like they're not integers, right? They're just tags that happen to look like numbers. So that's, in my mind, one of the failings of CVSS, but we'll get into that, I think, a little bit more in this deck. All right, so I'm going to walk you through here. What is CVSS? I wish I could see the audience so I could say, show of hands, who's ever seen CVSS before, but that will be very meaningless here because I can't see you. I can only see one person, and that's fine. Hello, yes. So CVSS, this is what a CVSS score looks like. And let's just walk through it, right? Starts off with the CVSS version number, very important. There's 2, there's 3.0, there's 3.1, there's 4, right? As mentioned, 3.1 is the most common, popular one, so we'll just focus on that. This right here is the access vector. This tells you if the bad guy can exploit this vulnerability over the network. Other possible values for this is over an adjacent network. So think of things like DHCP, right? Like DHCP is a protocol that is used in a local network. You generally don't see DHCP out on the internet. If you do, something's broken. And so you have network, local, or adjacent network, local, which means you have to be nearby. And that might be something like it is specifically not physical. So I don't have to touch the thing, but I have to be local to the thing. Usually local will often mean things like Wi-Fi, right? Like if I can hit your Wi-Fi signal, I can't do that from Canada, but I can do that from like the parking lot, right? And so your local zone is going to be like usually in the neighborhood of like 100 meters or so nearby, right? Like about the outer edge of like how good is Wi-Fi. There are people that do Wi-Fi shootouts where they get big old Yagi antennas and they shoot Wi-Fi for miles, and it's super awesome and fun. And occasionally this happens in DEF CON out in the desert. And so if you're a radio person, that can be fun. Also, I don't think you're allowed to do that without an FCC license. So get your amateur radio license and you too can play Wi-Fi shootouts. But anyway, that's what local is, right? So moving on, we have attack complexity. This is either low or high. And what this describes is essentially like, is there something that the attacker can't control? Or can the attacker control all aspects of the vulnerability? Great use case there is like it's a race condition and it only is exposed during certain periods in like how the system works, right? Like you might have to be under load, right? Like let's say it's a vulnerability in a web server that lets you do like I don't know, lets you escape from the web server into the operating system, but it only works if like the web server is under a lot of load, and I would have to do something to make that happen. So that's where your attack complexity is going to come in. Privilege required is either none, low, or high. So none means anybody can wander up and start attacking with this. Low means I need at least a user account. High means I need something better than a user account. Often this means like I already have to be an admin to do the thing, right? Or I have to have root access to do the thing. Which would beg the question, is it even a vulnerability if you're already root, right? If I'm already root, I can usually do something else. I don't need this vulnerability to do things. Um, but there are cases where like, for example, in like a web application, right? You might have admin on the web application, but that generally does not mean you also have root on the machine that the web application is running on, right? And so like I can only do this if I'm admin, but if I am admin, I can get something better, right, from an attacker. I often identify with the attacker, by the way. I'm going to probably accidentally use I and me and all of that describing attacking things. I generally don't attack things anymore, but it's just convenient. I also have like a penetration testing background, so every once in a while I am the attacker. But anyway, don't commit crimes. That's what I will tell you right now. Um, but I have complicated thoughts on that too. Okay. So user interaction is the case where you have to wait for somebody, some person, to do something in order to trigger your exploit with this vulnerability. The classical case here is like a file format bug. Almost all file format bugs have a user interaction component, which means like I email you a Word doc and it's got an evil macro and it lets me break out of Word sandbox and get into your operating system, right? Um, but in order for that to work, I need you to like open my Word doc. And I can't force you to do that, right? That is the classical user interaction component where it's either user interaction of none or some, essentially. It either requires user interaction or it doesn't. Um, we'll talk about that a little bit actually. So like there's some debate in some vulnerabilities. You will find this a lot in vulnerability scoring systems where these attributes that feel very objective often turn out to be kind of subjective. Again, I will talk to my astrology friends about why this is. And so you can have a situation where something maybe looks like user interaction is required, but actually there's some automated process that takes that user interaction away, right? And so that's all going to depend on like how this vulnerability manifests and exposes itself, right? So like I can very much so like there's been a few cases lately with things like GitHub Actions and vulnerabilities involving something that also involves GitHub Actions sometimes takes that user interaction component and turns it off, right? Like, oh, well, somebody would have to like merge my pull requests in order to like get the Git thing to do the thing. Well, you're in luck, attacker, because GitHub Actions is going to do that for you automatically. So in that case, the user interaction is now no longer required, right? So that's a subtlety that sometimes comes up. Scope is, I would say, the weirdest thing in CVSS. Nominally, it's pretty straightforward. If I attack system A, do I have an effect on system B? And scope will either be either changed or unchanged. Unchanged means nope, any attack I do on this thing, like a web server, like stays in the web server. But if I have a vulnerability that gives me a changed scope, so something like, let me think here. What's a good example of that? So like something like I can attack a web server and that gets me some special access to like a backing database that's somewhere else, right? In that case, my vulnerability may be a change scope. It's a little harder to articulate and really like think through. Most of the time, most vulnerabilities are scope cha unchanged. You don't often have a change of scope as a result of an exploit. Um, but that's depends on like where you say a vulnerability stops and an exploit payload starts, which is its own philosophical argument. Um, and so scope is also weird in CVSS because all of the math that goes into this non-mathy number of the score, it all pivots around scope. It's very strange if you go look at it. And I encourage you, if you're a math person, go look to see how all of these like contribute to the final number. You will notice that with scope, like you use one formula if scope is changed and another formula entirely if scope is unchanged. It's very strange. And it's they're kind of for a reason. Um, then we start getting into impact, and this is your classical CIA triad. When I say CIA triad, I'm not talking about a conspiracy between U.S. intelligence and Chinese thugs. I'm talking about I'm talking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is, do I get to learn a secret? And this can range from none, low to high. So none means I don't get to learn anything new. I don't get to learn anything secret. Low means I get to learn a secret, but it's kind of lame. I might be able to get like a list of usernames or something. So usernames are nominally not particularly secret, but user enumeration is definitely a thing that attackers do. So like that would usually be confidentiality low. I could get like a table of like all the IP addresses of what this machine has talked to lately, right? That would be like a confidentiality low kind of thing. Confidentiality high typically means passwords, API keys, um, full memory profile. I could get like a whole memory dump of like what the machine was running at the time that I exploited it, which itself will contain lots of secrets and cool stuff for me to do. I can get you Bitcoins. Like that would be confidentiality high, right? Integrity is, do I have some fresh new aspect of control over this machine? This is also none, low, and high. Essentially, so the classic um, vulnerability that anyone cares about is unauthenticated remote code execution, right? Like unauth RCE. If I have unauth RCE, I tend to be scoring pretty high on all of this, and specifically, my integrity is also high because I have remote code execution, usually in the context of root or bring zero if you're dealing with like a kernel bug or something like that. But like I can run code. It's high if I can run code as root or root equivalent for whatever this operating system is or whatever. It tends to be low. There is integrity impact, but I'm restrained in some way. Like I'm in some kind of like user sandbox or I have lame privileges or something like that. I would generally need to have both a vulnerability that gets me at least integrity low, and then I can couple that with another vulnerability that gets me like a privilege escalation once I'm already there. Right. So that would be like a very common chain of exploitation there. Availability is a very tricky one. People screw this one up all the time because if they say, well, if confidentiality impact is high and integrity impact is high, I have basically have total control over the machine. So obviously I can turn it off. I can RMRF the whole file system, and therefore my availability is also high. I say not true. This is again very subjective. Availability impact is typically supposed to be reserved for denial of service effects. So, like, I send you a packet of death, right? Like, I send you a malformed IP packet, and you keel like the machine keels over and dies. Like, can't handle that. I cause a crash. That will tend to be your availability high in the world. But so often, like when you're reading CVSS scores, which if you're like a total psycho like me and you do all the time, then you will see that people will often mark this as high, even though it doesn't really have anything to do with the vulnerability, which is a sad state of affairs. So anyway, that is the role that is the walkthrough of how CVSS scores are calculated, all the things that go into them, and it's super exciting. So you end up with a figure, right? From 0.0 to 10.0. Like I said, they're not really numbers, they're just labels. And then this is a score distribution graph of like what CVSS scores do we see in the world. And this is pulled from CVE. This is a graph of every CVE identified vulnerability on some arbitrary time scale. Let's say a 76-day period from November 5th, 2024 to January 20th, 2025. What does this curve look like? Well, we've got a little bit of in the zeros and ones, right? Which is fine. I mean, somebody reported something super lame. And then you get almost no ones, twos, threes, or fours. You start coming up on a curve on five. You end up in this like seven, and then you get like your peak is right around 7.2 to 7.8. I will tell you right now that the most common CVE score you will see is 7.8 because there's like 40 different ways to get there with the way that CVSS works. When you're mixing and matching all your 8 vectors, there's lots of ways to get to CVSS 7.8. There are very few ways to get to CVSS 1. I think there's only one combination that gets you to 1, and it's all lame. And then you see a big drop off, right, at 8, and then like a little bit of a bump when you get up to 10, right? Because people love hitting that availability number. You can only get 10 if your availability is also high. Your availability impact is also high. So that's why that number sees a little bit of a bump there at the end. Just because people get really excited about their CVSS 10.0s, like there's a prize or something. Anyway, this is a random sampling of a very particular time period, 76-day period, end of 2024. Now let's look at the entire year, July to July, 2024 to 2025. Looks kind of familiar. We see exactly the same distribution, even though this covers way more vulnerabilities and very different landscape of affected software. This is all software in the world, right? That CVE nominally covers. And so why is that? If we look at a 5-year period, it looks almost identical. I can go back and forth. Whoop, look at that. The curves are all exactly the same. So again, anybody with like a stats background in this classroom will say, aha, I think there's a problem with the way that we're scoring these vulnerabilities. And you'd be right. CVS is super great at measuring what it is. And all of the math is jiggered to make sure that like most things roll into that kind of like high severity and most things are very much not low severity. And also there's a little bit of a bump at the end of like super critical because those are the kinds of things that people want to see in vulnerability scoring, right? And so like any time scale, if you look in a 1-day period, in a 10-day, 100-day, 1,000-day period, you're going to see that same kind of like roller coaster curve, right? If it was truly random, right, it would be all over the place. And it should be, right? Because the people doing the vulnerability research are all like diverse population of people with various levels of skill. All of the software they're looking at is different. You would think maybe over time, we'd get better at writing software and not keep implementing the same bug over and over again. And that's not reflected in the CVSS data. There is a suspicious lack of low to medium vulnerabilities in that I think people find a bunch of low severity vulnerabilities and don't bother telling anyone about them. And so they just sit there and they're unidentified and they're just out there, which sucks because on the one hand, sure, don't waste my time with a bunch of low priority nonsense. But on the other hand, there are many, many cases where I can combine 2 or 3 or 4 vulnerabilities that individually are very low scoring, but summed together gets me unauth remote code execution, right? So I am worried about that. I'm worried that there is a cloud of low to medium severity vulnerabilities out there that is just like undetectable right now. Like I said, this pattern still persists today. We are still writing high severity bugs at the same rate we always have been. We're learning nothing in computer science. We're learning nothing in computer engineering about how to write better software, which like kind of flies in the face of, I don't want to say evidence, but like experience. I know like when you're writing a web application today here in 2025, you're generally not writing HTML by yourself. And you're using a framework, and it gets really hard to like accidentally SQL inject yourself, right? Or accidentally put in a cross-site scripting bug or something. and yet we continue to do it at almost exactly the same rate as we've always done it. And all this is to say the number is nonsense. Do not look at the number. The number is meaningless. The vectors are actually where the real action is. And so when you're studying, when you're being asked to make the call, is this a high severity thing or a low severity thing? Ignore the number, look at the vectors. If it's AVN, so if the axis vector is network and integrity impact is high and there's no user auth like requirement, so no privileges required, like you hit those three, this is something you want to look at. Anything that's not those three, maybe sort them a little bit lower. That as a first pass triage, right? Doesn't mean that they're not important. It just means like they're probably not as important as this one bug that hits those three vectors. And so like we'll take a look at, right? Like this is it, right here. If my access vector is physical, this is the inverse. Access vector is physical and the privileges required are low. That means I can see you typing at my keyboard a password. And so I don't really need CVSS to tell me something's wrong because the bad guy is in the house right now. They're there, they're doing the thing. So, this is a great way to like cut some out. There are not many there are not many CVE records, not many vulnerabilities that like hit this filter. But like this is the kind of filter I would say like, oh, I definitely don't care about this at all. I don't care what anything else is, as long as I see these two things, definitely don't care, right? There are some things happening today that are kind of built and derived from CVSS. One of them is this pipeline vulnerability scoring system, which seems kind of neat. It seems also more of the same. It has all the same problems as CVSS, where it's like the number's not a real number, and it will tend to have the same curve over and over again. But the attack vector is different, right? It's not network, local, physical, or adjacent. Is it in a public open source repo? Is it in a public repo, second order, whatever that means? Is it in a private repo, or is it like just like an on-prem thing? Is it my software control system, right? Is it that, or is it my CI/CD pipeline or something like that, right? So if you're interested in this kind of thing, take a look. Francois seems like a super nice guy. I got to meet him. He lives in Montreal, and he is taking this somewhat seriously. The AI VSS is more about the risks associated with agentic AI. And if you were waiting to see when I would first mention AI, that's it. That's it right there. I don't understand the AI VSS scoring system at all. They kind of use CVSS as a guide and then they layer a bunch of other stuff on top of it. It has like the backing of OWASP, and so they seem to be taking it seriously, but I don't know. Like I don't know. I don't think this thing has many legs to stand on. So I would take this with a huge grain of salt. You can mess around with the AI VSS calculator. It's online. Sometimes it even works. But it is looking to be, maybe it'll become an industry standard, even though it might be nonsense. So with EPSS is the next scoring system we're going to talk about. EPSS, the Exploit Prediction Scoring System. It first launched in 2021, and it promises predictions, which I'm all for. I love it. Predict all my exploits. That's awesome. EPSS is built on this notion that I have a bunch of data about a vulnerability. I know certain facets of it, CVSS being one of them, and all the CVSS vectors. And then I can also see like, well, what vulnerabilities have been exploited out in the world, and let's compare those. And like nominally, I should be able to say like, well, this vulnerability looks like that vulnerability, and that vulnerability got exploited, so this vulnerability might also get exploited, right? Because it has the same kind of features. It's very easy to think of it as like right side, left side. So like I guess if you're reading like in a Western, English style, you're reading left to right. So like on the left side, you'd have things like the CVS vectors. You'd also have like certain keywords in the description that just seem to come up on things that get exploited versus things that don't. Vendor reputation sometimes figures into this. Presence on the KEV. The KEV is the known exploited vulnerability list that is maintained by CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. See, I told you I would be expanding all my acronyms. It also looks at like hacker chatter, which is kind of a fun part of EPSS. Like it'll follow Mastodon threads, it'll follow Twitter threads, things like that, and say like, oh, important people I've heard of are talking about this, so let's bump up the score a little bit, right? And then on the right side, you look at things like honeypot hits, like have I seen activity on about this on the network? You look at like IDS, which is intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems, and have they been alerting on it? My EDR situation, right? Like I have endpoint detection and response agents running on all my desktops, right? Have they been freaking out about this vulnerability or vulnerabilities that look like this vulnerability? So kind of like a second order thing there. Plenty of vendor feeds, so places like Fortinet and Gray Noise, Shadow Server. Shadow Server is a big contributor to EPSS. And those all feed in, and then you do magic, not really magic, but it's you do some machine learning techniques to then be able to shake out like a factor of how likely is this thing going to get exploited in the next 30 days. It is agnostic on other things that aren't part of the model, right? Like, because that's how models work. All models are wrong, some models are useful. That is absolutely the case with EPSS. And they're not really ratings, right? Like, you don't have like a severity rating, but you do have a probability. And so you end up with a big long list. It is very much tied to CVE. EPSS only looks at the CVE set, and it recalculates every day. And so pretty much always, like if you scored at a 1% chance of getting exploited in the next 30 days, tomorrow you're probably also going to be about a 1% chance too. Tends to be how that works. And so when you take all these together and you see and you do just basic arithmetic and you say like, okay, well, I've got like 100 or no, how many is there in CVE right now? It's like it's about a quarter million. I have about a quarter million CVEs. Of those, some of them have a 1% chance, some of them have a 90% chance. If I average all those together and I run a big old Monte Carlo simulation and all these numbers, I come out to about 10,000 today. Actually, I think this has creeped up just a little bit since the Black Hat talk, but I get about 10,000 today that should be exploited per month, unique CVEs. And that seems ridiculous to me. That is ridiculously high. We generally don't see 10,000 unique CVEs exploited in the world in 1 month. That would be an apocalypse on the internet. Often, so like for example, SysACAV, which is a list of known exploited vulnerabilities, we've got just over 1,400 vulnerabilities listed on that list, right? And that covers all time caveat since Kev started, which is like 5 years ago or so. And then it backdates some. Like yeah, the oldest thing on Kev is from like 2007. But like all of the evidence that the US government has, about 1,400 or so, right? And the reason why that is because SysACAV requires a bunch of other things. SysACAV requires a real victim for starters. Like if you pop an exploit on a penetration test and your victim is consenting to this penetration test, doesn't count for Kev. If you are doing it in a lab, doesn't count for Kev. If you are maybe exploited a thing, but it might have also been this other thing or another thing or another thing, not going to count for Kev. Like, got to know like which vulnerability in particular is it? Because what Kev does is Kev is a list generated by the U.S. government that says, "Hey, rest of U.S. government, patch these first." And patch these first has to be right because if Kev very much favors a false negative to a false positive. I would much rather not know about a vulnerability and not kick off a government-wide patching order, essentially. This is all because of Binding Operational Directive 2201, but you don't care about that. We're not talking about how the government works. We're talking about how vulnerability scoring systems work. But anyway, Kev list is super low. And we know that it's low but it's not low by like, what is that, three orders of magnitude or something? Like Kev does not have 10,000 vulnerabilities per month getting hit. It's got 1,400, right? And that's because exploitation activity in EPSS is not just a breach, and it's not just like got root, right? The EPSS counts exploitation activity as, for starters, mere scanning of like vulnerable targets, right? If it looks like I'm scanning for this thing, that's going to count for EPSS. Doesn't matter if I actually try to exploit it or not. If I'm doing something that I can read that EPSS can reasonably link to a known vulnerability, then it'll count, regardless of the outcome of that. So attempted murder is just as good as murder, right? Like, and that is the case for EPSS. And things that are noisy and obvious will tend to push EPSS up. So like EPSS is going to be really bad at picking out like really hard to detect exploits, right? Like we've got something like 2,000 Linux kernel vulnerabilities in CVE today. Every one of those vulnerabilities is tends to be pretty hard to notice that it's been exploited, because a lot of times they're just DOS bugs. All they do is crash. And in modern Linux systems, if your kernel crashes, it doesn't mean blue screens. It doesn't mean like your system's out. It just means like, oh, it crashed. Whoop, let's come back. Like, let's because you have many cores and things have safety procedures on them, right? And so like merely crashing does not mean end of the world for that machine, right? So like that's the kind of thing that would be very subtle. I don't know why an attacker would even bother doing it. But maybe you do it in order to like get a new page, like refresh into memory or something like that, right? It would be a reason to do something else. But anyway, that kind of activity tends to not show up in EPSS, and therefore, like all of those bugs will tend to have low scores. So the interesting thing about EPSS is that the calculations are done every day, and sometimes things jump, which is interesting, right? So this is an example, something that jumped in the middle of July. This is a vulnerability that hung out in 0.8% chance of getting exploited in the next 30 days, and then suddenly on one specific day, it jumped up to 38.9% chance of getting exploited. This is it's from 2025. It's fairly recent. Um, it was released, I want to say in January. I would think this one was in January. And it was a WordPress bug for some WordPress plugin, right? You'll see a lot of these in CVE where it's like it's a vulnerability that affects a very particular WordPress plugin. So like you don't care if you're not running that plugin. You'd care a lot if you are running that plugin, right? You want to go fix that. Um, but I can't tell you, this is like a total mystery to me. Why is this one? Why did this get suddenly go from like basically no chance to closing in on a coin flip chance of getting split in the next 30 days? No idea. No idea. Can't tell you why. Some vulnerabilities will have a cycle, and we also don't know why that is. This is a great example from 2002, a very old vulnerability that probably wouldn't even qualify as a vulnerability today. It turns out, back in 2002, in under Internet Key Exchange, which is complicated. I won't get into it. But basically, you could leak a username over this key exchange. So this tends to hang out in in this like 38% category for some reason, then dips down to 16, 17%, then comes up, and then goes down again, then comes up. And it's hitting like the same two numbers over and over and over, like an oscillator. Total mystery. Don't know why. If you can figure out why, I got a Nobel Prize in computer science for you. It doesn't exist. I'll just make one up and give it to you. But this bothered me so much that we made a little web app at Run Zero. This is not an ad, don't worry. It's a free resource. It's called EPSS Pulse. You can look to see like which are the ones that have moved around a lot lately. Because invariably, even with the score, especially with the scores going up, with the prediction rates going up, like that tends to mean something happened in the world. And it's a little mystery to solve every day, which is super fun. It's like Sudoku, but for like InfoSec nerds. And you can see things because like I've been able to look and see things like which on this particular screenshot, yes, 1647. CV 2021 1647. I do believe landed on the Kev, landed on the SZA Kev, and so the fact of being on the Kev tends to jump EPSS scores by about 35 points. This is discovered through just brute force, basically. Like I went and looked every day to see like why were these scores jumping around? Can I explain them? And the things that tend to move them are Kev. Someone released a Metasploit module that exploits this vulnerability that tends to move the exploitation prediction up. And nuclei templates is another big one. EPSS favors nuclei templates quite a bit. If you're not familiar with nuclei, get familiar with nuclei because it's new hotness. It's very cool. It's a very easy way to express vulnerabilities and exploits. But EPSS's pulse is super neat. So take a look. If you happen to, thank you. If you happen to figure it out, great. Tell people, why this happened. Why scores go down, also more of a mystery even. I still don't have good explanations for that because it's not like Metasploit modules go away. And it's not like things get pulled off the cab very often. Like it does happen. We've done it twice. But I don't know why you have sudden crashes in scores either. So that's Pulse. Take a look. I don't have an RSS feed for you yet. You should take a look. I don't know if this is a valuable indicator or not, or if we're back into the realm of haruspicy. I really don't. I think there might be something there, but I'm not super duper sure. And I'm very interested in detective work. So if you find out, tell me. I'm easy to find on the internet. Based on EPSS is the LEV, which is the likely exploited vulnerabilities list. And it is basically a paper from NIST that says, hey, how come Kev lists are so short? How come we only have, 1,000 or 1,500 or something on a Kev list when we can tell that like things should be getting exploited a lot more often? And that's the paper. The math is pretty good. It does take it does start from first principles that are a little bit shaky, I think, but the authors are very smart people. They answer questions, all that stuff. SSVC is not just CVSS backwards. It is the stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization system. This is a system that is not nearly as mathy as the other two. What this does is that it takes certain features of the vulnerability, much like EPSS, but boils it down to like 5 things you actually care about. It's very human oriented. A human can perform SSVC. In fact, I've done it. It does require like some pretty good awareness of your environment. It does require you to know like what does your target environment look like. It's not really a scoring system. It does end in these in decision points, right? Okay, so I know this thing about a vulnerability. What do I do next? Who do I have to wake up? Who do I have to bother? Can I sit on and like have it in a weekly roll-up report or something like that, right? It is a fine system. It was developed by SZA. It was in conjunction with Carnegie Mellon University. Go fighting whatever they have. And they put this together. It's all open, licensed, everything like that. You're more than welcome to use it. It is basically severity. We won't get into it too much. This thing is an eye chart. You are not expected to read it. But I will walk through it super fast of like how we get from a decision to an action, right? And so like the things that SSVC cares about is there exploitation in the world already? Like, do we know it's being exploited? Or is there a proof of concept application? Is there a proof of concept exploit out there that actually works, right? So check that off. Is it automatable? Can I run this and release it? SSVC is very worm aware, like it's very interested in worms. Like I'm not as interested in SSVC if like hands-on keyboard attackers. I'm interested in something that like propagates through the network and like messes up everybody's day. What is the technical impact? So everything about CVSS boiled into this question, right? Is it total technical impact or is it partial technical impact? Because if there's no technical impact, it's not a vulnerability, don't care. But if there is, and so this tells me like, oh, do I have like remote root or do I just get something lame? That's going to make a difference for SSVC. And then finally, how important are the targets? which is probably the hardest thing to answer. You can't answer it generally across the internet, but you can probably answer it in your enterprise, right? So like, is this thing critical to my business functions? Or if this thing falls over, falls into the hands of an attacker, are people going to die? Like in either case, is the floor going to get wet? Basically, like is this thing controlling like a pump actuator, or is it going to let all the liquids out of nearby humans? Like that, those questions are very important for SSVC. Once you know that, then you know if it's either like a track, a monitor, or an attend or an act, and it's up to you to define what that means for you. And so, what SFCC is really just tarot reading, as far as I can tell. I even help with some of like defining what SSVC is, and this is my takeaway. I do think it's useful. I think it is. I think it gets you to a point where you have something to say to management of like, I have these vulnerabilities like shook out as like something bad on SSVC, so we should do something about them. Doesn't tell you what to do, but something should be done, right? The other upside is today, CISA is providing exploitation evidence like directly in CVE records. So you don't even have to do a lot of that work anymore. It's being done for you. I would say free, but it's just your tax dollars, so it's not really free. They also provide technical impact, and triaging just on those two gets you kind of a long way, right? Like you can take your list of CVEs, you can see if technical impact and exploitation are already known in the world. If so, these are the CVEs to look at, right? It's still on you, though, to know about your environments. But in reality, the real vulnerability scoring system is the friends we made along the way. And I mean that kind of literally, where it's not just a joke. These scoring systems are useful-ish. They all have something that you can take out of them, but I wouldn't use them like as is, right? Um, Things that are LLMs can do some of this work, but you really do need an expert for human judgment. And none of these scoring systems will tell you which vulnerabilities an attacker is going to exploit, because exploitation is not weather. Exploitation is a conscious event undertaken by a person who has their own motivations, right? And sometimes those motivations are bad and sometimes they're good and whatever, usually bad when we're talking about exploitation, but sometimes it's a good idea, right? Like sometimes you want to like topple a regime and so you're going to hack their computers and like that is nominally, like this is R2D2's job. This is R2D2 is an attacker, by the way. Everything he does in that movie is hacking the empire. So in that movie, like there's only one. The best thing you can do for figuring out if a particular vulnerability is worth paying attention to is ask your friends. And so ideally, you make friends in the industry who have been around the block, who have seen this kind of vulnerability. This is kind of like what EPSS does, but in a machiney way. You can do this in a very human meat-based way, through trust groups, through just like people on staff that have been here and have seen the last attack and like know about the next attack, all of that, right? So that's it. Here are my QR codes. I got 5 minutes for questions. End of message.
Thank you so much, Todd. Appreciate you taking the time to speak to us about this. We want to open the floor for any questions because you guys did just get a black hat talk.
I know this thing costs like $20,000.
Before I rattle his ears off with questions, does anybody have questions in the room or on Zoom?
Is this pre-recorded or like recorded so I can access it?
Oh yeah, this has been recorded and we'll be sharing this out. Kind of on that note, I see a couple of QR codes here, and that center one looks like something where people can reach you.
Yes.
I found your contact information through your GitHub, and I also found your LinkedIn. Right. Would we be able to share those accounts with the club if they have questions after the fact?
Yep. I believe that QR code goes to my GitHub repo.
Oh, okay.
That has links to everything else.
Yeah. All right. You.
There's a question in the chat who's calling me out on I have complicated thoughts on attackers. And that is, so the short story is that I think offensive security is crucial for cybersecurity. Not all attackers are evil. Some attackers are, in the classical sense, right, are merely researchers looking to find out like why systems work the way they do and where are the vulnerabilities so they can do something about them, right? So like we've got a whole bunch of law on the books that like make hacking a crime, right? And some hacking is not a crime. So like for example, it is a crime to repair your own farming equipment is a pretty good example, right? That industry is notorious for locking farmers out of their own equipment through technological means. So you have to call the manufacturer and they have to send a guy, and that guy's going to charge you $5,000 to install some firmware, right? That sucks. But that's the world we live in, right? That's the law. That's the kind of criminal offensive security research that I think is laudable and should be done. That's my complicated thought.
Thanks
Don't
for,
commit crime.
thanks for your answer to his question. I have another question for you.
Yeah.
So just so I guess a real brief actually, because we're running out of time. What was your cyber journey like, or I say, how did you, if it happened later after like college, did you pivot into the field or?
Yes. So don't commit crime. I started by committing crimes. And this is not a very viable way to do it today. I don't know if you can tell from the coloration of my beard. I've been around the block for a while. I think my first real, I mean, I started doing what we call cybersecurity now in the late 20th century, which is a wonderful way to describe the 90s. And there really wasn't much of an industry then. We had things like Nmap and Satan, and it was still called Satan then until it got renamed to Saint. These are tools that are like built by hacker types to kind of make and everybody in the field were new at the office. Like we didn't really have office jobs for that. I waited tables for 3 years, right? I was involved in a band for a little while. Like the security stuff was a hobby until it became an industry, and then I was involved in the industry. So the things I cared about in school and before were like for whatever reason I really cared about the phone system. I thought the telephone network of planet Earth was was like top 5 inventions on planet Earth, right? Like you have fire, wheel, electricity, steam powered telephones, right? Like that was my thinking basically. And I really want to know how phones worked. And so naturally that led me into this like weird criminal underworld of phone freaking and like making free phone calls back when long distance cost. But that was my intro. So like don't commit crimes. Crimes are bad, generally speaking, for your career. Um, but I would say just like if you're interested in like how things work, like be nerdy about it, right? And you know, there are 20 different specialties at least in cybersecurity. Pick one and be good at that one. Yeah, and no, you will have imposter syndrome for the other 19 for sure. And people will like make fun of you for like not knowing the thing. Like you know, whatever. I barely can write C anymore. I have not written anything in C in forever. I barely can do operating system management. Everything I do these days is crazy high level. Like, you know, I got really proud of myself for doing some statistical analysis using SQL, you know, so like 10 steps away from the operating system from the metal, right? So like, so I'm a giant poser and loser. You can be too.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for taking that time. We are running a little bit short on time. The next class is already in the room, but thank you so much for coming out to speak with us, even though it was only virtually. We would have loved to have you here in person.
Someday I'll return.
I will make sure to thank Greg for sending us your way. And,
Sure.
we will be sure to share out your contact information if anybody wants to ask any questions after this meeting.
If you solve any EPSS mysteries, let me know. I want to know why these things move around.
All right, thank you so much, Tom. You have a good day.
All right, later on.
All right, and